March 23, 1945. 2,100 hours. The western bank of the Rhine River, near Wesel, Germany. Oberleutnant. Wilhelm Steinberg's binoculars trembled slightly as he scanned the darkening waters, recording observations in his field notebook that would later be found among captured German documents at Army Group headquarters. His handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, reflecting years of Wehrmacht staff training. The Americans have reached our sacred river, but they cannot cross. No army has ever forced the Rhine against determined German resistance without bridges. Through the gathering dusk, he had just observed something that reinforced 3 years of Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. Artillery flashes illuminated the western bank. Thousands of guns, preparing for what German commanders expected would be a traditional river assault requiring days of preparation. Fixed bridging operations, and vulnerable crossing points, their 88mm guns could systematically destroy. In Germany, the Rhine had protected the nation for 2 millennia. Even now, with the Reich crumbling from east and west, military engineers assured commanders that the river's 1,300-foot width and swift currents made it impossible to cross without lengthy engineering preparations. It would provide ample opportunity for counterattack. But at that very moment, 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, Black Watch, were preparing to enter the water, not in vulnerable assault boats that would shuttle back and forth under fire, not waiting for engineers to complete pontoon bridges under artillery bombardment, but aboard vehicles that German intelligence had catastrophically failed to properly assess. The strange boat-shaped trucks designated DUKW had been observed in Normandy and Italy, but Wehrmacht analysts dismissed them as specialized landing craft for beach operations, irrelevant to river warfare. The mathematics of Rhine defense were about to be shattered, not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by American industrial ingenuity that German defenders never imagined could be brought to bear on their last natural fortress. What was about to unfold represented a systematic failure of intelligence that would transform Germany's uncrossable moat into a highway for Allied armor, and demonstrate that in modern industrial warfare, the nation that could mass-produce pragmatic solutions would triumph over the nation that handcrafted perfect weapons in insufficient numbers. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story of innovation, industrial might, and the final collapse of Nazi Germany's defenses, take a moment to subscribe if you love World War II history, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Now, let's understand how two fundamentally different approaches to warfare, one rooted in traditional military thinking, the other in industrial problem solving, collided at the Rhine with consequences that would end the war weeks earlier than expected. The collapse had begun months earlier, not on the battlefield, but in German intelligence assessments. Generaloberst Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Runst, would later testify to Allied interrogators about the Wehrmacht's fundamental misreading of American amphibious capabilities. Intelligence reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy had described Schwimmwagen, swimming trucks, but German analysts filed these among the curiosities of American excess. Like ice cream ships and Coca-Cola battalions, they appeared in the same category as other American peculiarities that German officers found simultaneously amusing and contemptible: the American obsession with creature comforts, their casual approach to military formality, their apparent willingness to let industrial capacity substitute for warrior discipline. Among the defenders was Major Hansgorg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured after his surrender in April 1945, would provide historians with extraordinary insight into German assumptions about Rhine defense. The Wehrmacht's most experienced officers, men who had studied river crossings from the Dnieper to the Seine, believed they understood the immutable laws of amphibious assault. He wrote on March 20th. Attackers needed overwhelming artillery superiority, specialized bridging equipment, and most critically, time to establish crossing points that defenders could target. The Rhine gives us all these advantages. Its width prevents rapid crossing. Its current limits boat operations. Its symbolic importance to the German people ensures every soldier will fight to the death to defend it. But the first real revelation of German ignorance came in assessment documents discovered at captured headquarters. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 5th 10th Army, had compiled reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW exactly 3 times in 6 months of documentation. Each reference dismissed them as coastal operations equipment with no relevance to river warfare. The reports estimated American forces possessed perhaps 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theater. This catastrophic underestimation wasn't the result of poor intelligence. Gathering German reconnaissance had observed DUKWs multiple times, but rather reflected a failure of imagination rooted in Germany's own industrial limitations and cultural assumptions about warfare. The reality was staggering, revealing an intelligence failure of historic proportions. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs operated in the European theater. The U.S. Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. These units had practiced river crossing operations since Normandy, developing doctrine that German intelligence never detected. The British had received 2,000 DUKWs through Lend-Lease, adding their own operational innovations drawn from years of combined operations experience. Canadian forces operated 800 units with specialized cold weather modifications. The Allies possessed an entire fleet of amphibious vehicles that could render Germany's river defenses obsolete, and German intelligence had missed it entirely. This failure illuminates a broader truth about why Germany lost the Second World War. For all its tactical brilliance and operational expertise, operated within a framework of assumptions shaped by Germany's industrial limitations and cultural values. Because Germany could only produce specialized equipment in small numbers through craft production methods, German officers assumed their opponents faced similar constraints. Because German military culture valued quality over quantity, perfection over adequacy, they assumed American mass production reflected inferior craftsmanship rather than a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare. The intelligence failure at the Rhine wasn't just about missing specific equipment. It was about failing to understand that America approached warfare as an industrial problem to be solved through mass production, standardization, and pragmatic engineering rather than as an art form requiring perfect weapons wielded by warrior elites. The DUKW's development represented American problem-solving at its most characteristically efficient, born not from military doctrine but from a minor incident that sparked a revolution in amphibious warfare. In April 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts conventional trucks couldn't reach it through surf and sand. This seemingly trivial problem, how to rescue a boat stuck just offshore, would ultimately help destroy the Third Reich. Palmer Coslet Putnam, working for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, partnered with yacht designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Puliston to envision a truck that could transition seamlessly from water to land. When Ford Motor Company declined the project, claiming it was impossible to complete in the required time frame, General Motors Corporation accepted the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked with an urgency that reflected America's awakening to total war. By June 2, 1942, just 38 days later, the first prototype rolled out. This compressed development cycle concept, 2 prototype, in barely more than a month would have been unthinkable in the German system. Where development typically required years of testing and refinement, the vehicle combined a standard GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck chassis with a watertight hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens, the yacht architects who had designed America's cup racing yachts. The designation DUKW came from GMC's utilitarian nomenclature system. D4 1942 design year, U4 utility, K4 all-wheel drive, and W4 dual rear axles. There was no romantic name, no appeal to military tradition, just a functional designation that captured the American approach to warfare. The secret to the DUKW's versatility lay in several innovations that reflected pragmatic engineering rather than theoretical perfection. Frank Spear, from GMC's engineering team, developed the central tire inflation system, the world's first such system, allowing drivers to adjust tire pressure while moving. At 10 to 12 pounds per square inch, the tires spread wide for sand and mud traction. At 40 to 45 psi, they provided highway efficiency, A 25-inch propeller driven through a transfer case from the main transmission provided water propulsion at 5.5 knots, while a rudder linked to the steering wheel allowed seamless transition from water to land navigation. The engineering was clever, but not revolutionary, combining existing technologies in new ways, rather than requiring breakthrough innovations. Major General Jacob Devers observed the first demonstration in June 1942 and immediately grasped the implications. He ordered mass production before extensive testing was complete, a decision that would have been impossible in the risk-averse German system. The initial contract called for 2,000 units. By war's end, GMC had manufactured 21,147 DUKWs at the unprecedented pace of 525 per month during peak production. Each costs $10,750, roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, but with capabilities that would prove priceless. The production numbers themselves tell a story about American industrial capacity. Germany's entire production of its comparable vehicle, the Landwirtschaftsschlepper, totaled approximately 100 units. America produced 200 DUKWs for every single German amphibious vehicle, a ratio that would be repeated across almost every category of military equipment. March 1945 found Germany's Rhine defenses in a state Wehrmacht commanders refused to acknowledge even to themselves, clinging to the illusion that Germany's sacred river would provide the barrier that had protected the nation since Roman times. General Alfred Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, the most effective German force remaining in the West, had been bled white in the Reichswald battles, losing 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The reinforcements arriving to defend the Rhine were Volkssturm units, old men and boys with a few weeks of training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of uniforms. These were not the elite soldiers who had conquered Europe in 1940, but desperate conscripts told to hold a line that their own officers knew was indefensible. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division, positioned near Wessel, wrote in a letter to his wife dated March 20th that captures the mixture of hope and desperation that characterized German thinking. The Americans are across from us now, thousands of them. We can hear their vehicles day and night, but the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon could not cross the Rhine against opposition. The engineers have destroyed every bridge, and our artillery has every possible crossing point registered. If we can hold them here for even 2 weeks, perhaps there can be negotiations. The Führer speaks of miracle weapons. I don't believe in miracles, but I believe in the Rhine. The defensive preparations appeared formidable on paper, reflecting years of German engineering expertise and defensive doctrine. Since September 1944, over 200,000 civilian laborers had been conscripted to strengthen the West Wall fortifications and extend them toward the Rhine. 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions had been constructed or reinforced. The river itself provided what German doctrine called the perfect water obstacle: too wide for assault bridges, too swift for boats, too deep for fording. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had assumed command in the West after von Rundstedt's dismissal, issued orders that revealed German assumptions shaped by centuries of military history. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads after initial crossings. This window provides opportunity for counterattack with our mobile reserves. These mobile reserves consisted of 47 Panzer Corps with approximately 150 operational armored vehicles, assault guns, and tank destroyers. Kambun II cover a front of nearly 200 miles. The mathematics of defense seemed sound to German planners. The Rhine's width meant attackers would be vulnerable during crossing. The limited number of suitable crossing sites meant German artillery could pre-register targets. The time required to build bridges meant German reserves could concentrate against specific threats. Every assumption was logical, supported by military history and contemporary doctrine. Every assumption was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. But the most critical German failure was conceptual rather than material. Wehrmacht's doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, understood river crossings as sequential operations, each phase providing opportunities for German First, suppress defenders with artillery. Second, send infantry across in assault boats. Third, establish small bridgeheads. Fourth, begin bridge construction under fire. Fifth, reinforce gradually as bridges were completed. Finally, send armor across. The process was methodical, predictable, and vulnerable at every stage. German officers who had orchestrated brilliant river crossings on the Eastern Front, who had studied Napoleon's campaigns and World War I river assaults, believed they understood the immutable physics and logistics of amphibious operations. Unknown to German intelligence, the Allied forces had assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles in history along the Rhine's western bank, preparing to execute an operation that would render German defensive doctrine obsolete. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in concealed areas within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been waterproofed, mechanically inspected, and loaded with specific cargo manifests designed to maintain water stability. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, recalled the meticulous preparation that reflected American systematic approach to logistics. We knew this wasn't Normandy with tides and beach obstacles. The Rhine was about current, about exit points, about coordinating with artillery so we didn't get hit by our own shells. We practiced on the Maas River for 2 weeks, learning how the ducks handled in fast scurrying, how to calculate drift, how to find exit points in darkness. The vehicles themselves had been modified based on 3 years of combat experience, each modification representing lessons learned and systematically incorporated. Armor plating protected drivers and vital mechanical components from small arms fire. Ring mounts 4.50 caliber machine guns provided self-defense capability that would prove crucial. Most critically, specialized bilge pumps could handle water intake from small arms fire, allowing DUKWs to continue operating even when their hulls were perforated, a level of redundancy and damage tolerance that reflected American engineering philosophy, prioritizing survivability over Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company described the final briefing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done. Use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing. Not support vessels, not supply carriers after the bridges were built, but the actual spearhead. Each duck would carry a full rifle squad with equipment, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and deposit troops directly into combat positions. No boats, no bridges, no waiting. Just drive across and keep going. The British forces had their own amphibious assets that would complement American The 79th Armored Division under Major General Percy Hobart. Hobo's Funnies, as they were known, had brought 6 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each capable of carrying 30 men. These vehicles, originally designed for Pacific Island assaults, would work alongside the American DUKWs, and what would become the largest amphibious river crossing in military history. But it was the DUKWs, with their ability to seamlessly transition from water to land operations, that would prove most devastating to German assumptions. Unlike the Buffaloes, which were primarily water vehicles with limited land mobility, the DUKWs could literally drive from the English Channel to Berlin, if necessary, crossing every river without pause. At 1700 hours on March 23, 1945, the greatest artillery bombardment of the Rhine campaign commenced, a demonstration of Allied firepower that would have been unimaginable to military planners just a generation earlier. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from British 25-pounders to American 240mm howitzers, unleashed a 4-hour barrage that seemed to turn the air itself into a solid wall of steel and explosive. The sound was beyond description, a continuous thunder that could be heard over 100 miles away. German observers reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling under the impact of thousands of shells per minute, the earth itself seeming to liquefy under the bombardment. Hefreiter Heinrich Manning, an observation post near West, attempted to count the muzzle flashes across the river, a futile exercise that captured the overwhelming disparity in firepower. I stopped at 500. It was like looking at a solid line of flames stretching north and south as far as I could see. The noise was beyond description, not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that made thought impossible. I understood then that we were not facing an army, but an industrial force, a machine that could turn shells into rain. His observation captured a truth that many German soldiers were discovering. They were fighting not another military force, but the combined industrial capacity of America, Britain, and the Commonwealth. An adversary that could expend more ammunition in an hour than Germany produced in a month, under cover of this bombardment and darkness. The first DUKWs, entered the Rhine at 2,100 hours, beginning an operation that would prove more decisive than the artillery that preceded it. The 51st Highland Division led the assault, with the 7th Battalion Black Watch loaded into DUKWs, operated by American crews from specialized amphibious truck companies. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers, plus its 2-man crew, a driver, and a navigator who also served as machine gunner. Navigation lights, shielded to be visible only from behind, marked entry and exit points on both banks, a level of organization and planning that reflected months of preparation. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch described the crossing with vivid detail that captures both the terror and the strange mundanity of the experience. We rolled down the bank and suddenly we were floating. The American driver just kept driving like we were still on land. Except now, water was rushing past at tremendous speed. The engine noise was terrific. You couldn't hear artillery over it, and we could hear German shells hitting the water around us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness and smoke. It felt unreal, like driving through a nightmare. Then, maybe 8 minutes later, we're driving up the far bank, and the driver yells, "Welcome to Germany, boys," like we'd just crossed the street. The current proved stronger than expected, 8 to 10 knots in the main channel, a hazard that would have doomed traditional boat operations but which the DUKWs were designed to handle. Vehicles launched upstream of their intended landing points, their drivers calculating drift like navigators plotting aircraft courses in crosswinds. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but their ability to drive up any reasonably sloped bank meant they could exit the river wherever they found themselves. Flexibility that made German defensive planning, based on protecting specific landing zones, completely ineffective. By 2,200 hours, the first wave was across. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for second waves, instead heard only the continued roar of artillery. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and disappeared into the darkness, their passengers already engaging German positions from unexpected directions. This was the moment when German defensive doctrine began to unravel. Officers watching crossing sites reported no boat traffic, no bridge construction, no pattern they recognized. Yet radio reports indicated Allied troops were appearing inland in company and battalion strength. The mathematics no longer made sense. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving reports that defied explanation and challenged every assumption they held about amphibious operations. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland from crossing points in battalion strength with heavy weapons and supplies. The expected pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once, a presence that suggested far larger numbers than could possibly have crossed. Optimon Karl Richter, commanding a battery of 88mm guns positioned to cover the crossing site at Ries, reported to divisional headquarters with barely controlled panic. "Enemy armor is behind us." Repeat. "Enemy armor is behind our position." How did they get across? "All bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction. Request immediate support." What Richter had encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons mortar, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland. The vehicle's amphibious capability allowed them to bypass German strongpoints positioned to defend obvious routes from the riverbank. This wasn't infiltration or clever tactical maneuver. It was industrial capacity making geography irrelevant. The strongpoints that German engineers had spent months constructing, carefully sited to control approaches from the river, suddenly found themselves bypassed by an enemy that simply drove around them. The scale of the operation became apparent as morning fog lifted, revealing a sight that German observers would remember for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of DUKWs were shuttling across the Rhine in continuous streams, creating what appeared to be highways across water. Unlike assault boats that required engineer crews and were limited to perpendicular crossings at prepared sites, DUKWs could enter and exit the river anywhere banks permitted. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing at dozens of points along a 22-mile front. The dispersion made concentrated defensive fire impossible. Major Wilhelm Hofmann, operations officer for the 185th Division, recorded in his war diary an entry that captures the German realization that they faced something unprecedented. The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they're crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously. It is like trying to stop rain with a machine gun. The British Second Army's crossing at Wesel employed a devastating combination of DUKWs and Buffalo LV, creating overlapping waves of amphibious vehicles that German defenders found impossible to track or target effectively. The 15th Scottish Division crossed in Buffaloes, while DUKWs brought their heavy weapons and supplies. By 080 hours, despite fierce resistance from the 1st Parachute Army, some of Germany's best remaining troops, 3 full divisions, were across the Rhine with their complete equipment loads. This represented a crossing rate that would have required at least a week using traditional methods, accomplished instead in less than 12 hours. At 1,000 hours, on March 24th, the thunder of aircraft engines added to the battle's cacophony, announcing the arrival of Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. The operation involved more than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,350 gliders, carrying 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops from the U.S. 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions. This wasn't the isolated paratroop drop German doctrine expected, but a coordinated hammer blow designed to work with the amphibious assault in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of both operations. Obergefreiter Franz Weber of the 84th Infantry Division watched from his position near Hemmingen with a mixture of awe and horror. The sky turned black with aircraft. Not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. Parachutes bloomed like flowers everywhere you looked. We thought this was the main assault, that the river crossings were Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. We were surrounded without realizing we'd been outflanked. That's when I knew the war was truly lost, not because we lacked courage, but because we were fighting an enemy that could be in front of us and behind us simultaneously. The airborne forces landed within artillery range of the Rhine crossings, something German commanders hadn't anticipated because it violated the traditional doctrine of airborne operations. Previous Allied airborne operations, Market Garden, Normandy, Sicily, had dropped paratroopers far behind enemy lines to operate independently for days. This time they landed just 6 miles from the river, directly supporting the amphibious forces. The coordination between airborne and amphibious forces multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove directly to airborne positions that in previous operations would have required air supply or days to link up with ground forces. Wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs, returning to the western bank within hours of being injured. Something impossible in traditional airborne operations where casualties typically waited days for evacuation. Private First Class Donald Baget of the 17th Airborne later wrote about an encounter that captured the surreal nature of this integrated operation. We were fighting for this crossroads, taking casualties from a German machine gun position, when these weird-looking truck boats came driving up through the woods. No splashing, no bogging down. They just drove out of the tree line like regular trucks, except we knew they'd just crossed the Rhine. The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo?" We thought we were hallucinating. Here we jumped out of airplanes expecting to be cut off and surrounded, and instead we've got supply trucks that swim showing up like we're at a depot. By noon, on March 24th, the full implications of the DUKW assault became clear to German commanders at every level, from battalion officers to Army Group headquarters. This wasn't just a new way to cross rivers. It was a complete revolution in amphibious logistics that invalidated every assumption in German defensive planning and represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare itself. Traditional river crossings required sequential phases, each providing opportunities for defense. First came assault crossing, vulnerable to artillery and machine gun fire. Then bridgehead consolidation, requiring troops to hold limited areas against counterattack. Then bridge construction, creating fixed targets that concentrated defenders could destroy. Finally, supply buildup, a slow process limited by bridge capacity. Each phase was vulnerable. Each phase provided German commanders with decision points where counterattacks could succeed. The DUKWs eliminated these vulnerabilities entirely, creating a new operational reality that German doctrine had no framework to address. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, logistics officer for the 16th Corps, had established what he called DUKW highways across the Rhine, continuous streams of amphibious vehicles that operated like ferry services, but without the vulnerabilities of fixed crossing points. Vehicles loaded on the western bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. No unloading at the riverbank, no transfer to different vehicles, no waiting for bridges that might be destroyed. We were running 50 ducks per hour at our crossing point. Sims reported with justified pride. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies, or 25 men. That's 125 tons of supplies, or 1,250 troops every hour, around the clock. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any just trucks driving through water as casually as driving down a highway. But the achievement wasn't merely logistical. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating in ways that pure firepower could never accomplish. Regiment wrote in his diary an entry that reveals the spiritual collapse that accompanied military defeat. They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges. They don't need anything we can destroy. It is like fighting ghosts that pass through walls. Every defensive principle we learned, every tactic we practiced, becomes meaningless when the enemy simply drives across what should be an impenetrable barrier. This is not defeat in battle. This is obsolescence. Supply sergeants reported surreal experiences that captured the transformation of warfare from desperate struggle to industrial logistics operation. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division described establishing a supply dump with an anecdote that perfectly illustrates the absurdity of total industrial war. We're 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side, right? And here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared breakfast, loaded it in the dock, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee, hot eggs, bacon in the middle of a battle, 3 miles into Germany. The Germans must have thought we were insane, maybe. But we were winning. March 25th dawned with German commanders facing a situation Wehrmacht doctrine had never addressed, a military crisis that transcended tactics or strategy to reveal fundamental inadequacies in Germany's entire approach to modern warfare. The Rhine, Germany's historic barrier, had become irrelevant, not conquered, not breached, but simply bypassed by American industrial ingenuity that German intelligence had dismissed as a curiosity. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, held a commander's conference that morning in a farmhouse near Brunnen. The surviving record of this meeting, compiled from testimonies of captured officers and fragmentary diary entries, reveals the depth of German dismay and the dawning recognition that they had lost more than a battle. Schlemm reportedly told his assembled officers with remarkable candor, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress according to principles we understood. Instead, they drove around it as if our defenses didn't exist. We are not losing to better soldiers or superior tactics. We are losing to a system of warfare we failed to imagine was possible." The admission was extraordinary, coming from one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, and it reflected a broader truth that many German officers were beginning to grasp. They had been defeated not on the battlefield but in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of the American East Coast. The numbers were staggering and told a story of systematic German intelligence failure. In the first 48 hours alone, DUKWs had transported over 15,000 troops across the Rhine. More critically, they had moved 1,200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and light armor that traditional crossing methods wouldn't have delivered for days. Artillery pieces were being ferried across and firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence even confirmed that major crossings had occurred. The speed and scale violated every German planning assumption. Oberst Heinrich Bohn, commanding the remnants of Panzer Brigade 16, attempted to counterattack near Wessel on March 25th in an operation that would demonstrate the futility of traditional armored counterattacks against this new form of warfare. His unit's war diary records the confusion and frustration. Attacked Third River to destroy enemy bridgehead. Found no bridgehead in traditional sense. Enemy forces distributed across 15-kilometer front with no apparent center. Swimming vehicles continuously reinforcing all points. Impossible to identify. Critical target concentrated our armor against what appeared to be main crossing site. Enemies simply crossed elsewhere. Attack failed with heavy losses. Recommend immediate withdrawal or face encirclement. The British were achieving similar success across their sectors, demonstrating that the DUKW revolution wasn't limited to American operations. The Scottish divisions had pushed 6 miles inland by end of March 25th, supported by continuous DUKW supply runs that maintained momentum impossible in traditional river crossings. Royal Artillery Forward observers were calling in fire missions while riding in DUKWs, using the vehicle's mobility to avoid German counter-battery fire. The entire system represented a level of integration between firepower, logistics, and maneuver that German forces, hamstrung by fuel shortages and limited mobility, could never match. Yet even as Allied forces achieved this remarkable success, the human cost demanded acknowledgement. Despite the tactical and technological superiority demonstrated at the Rhine, the crossing was not bloodless, and the price paid by individual soldiers on both sides reminds us that industrial advantage doesn't eliminate human suffering. Allied casualties for operations Plunder and Varsity totaled 6,781 to 3,968. British and Commonwealth, 2,813. American, these numbers, while far lower than traditional river assault casualties would have been, still represented thousands of families receiving devastating telegrams. Thousands of futures ended or permanently altered. The airborne forces suffered particularly heavily from German anti-aircraft fire, with some aircraft shot down before troops could jump. The 17th Airborne Division lost 430 killed in action in a single day, casualty rates approaching 20% in some units. DUKWs evacuating wounded came under German artillery fire, with several vehicles lost with all aboard. Crews and casualties together dying in the Rhine they had crossed successfully just hours before. Private Oscar Fredrickson, a combat engineer with the 89th Infantry Division, described his unit's crossing at St. Gorshausen on March 26th with stark honesty about the continued dangers. We lost 250 men out of 420 trying to establish our sector. The DUKWs got us across. Fast that part worked like advertised. But the Germans were waiting on the high ground with machine guns and mortar. They couldn't stop the crossing, but they made us pay for every yard. Speed doesn't make you bulletproof. Technology doesn't make war easy. It just changes how you die. German casualties were catastrophic, reflecting not just military defeat, but the complete disintegration of defensive coherence. The 1st Parachute Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Over 16,000 prisoners were captured in the first 72 hours, most surrendering not from cowardice, but from recognition that continued resistance was militarily pointless. Many simply abandoned positions once they realized the Rhine barrier had failed, understanding that they were surrounded or soon would be. Entire units found themselves cut off as DUKW transported forces appeared behind them with bewildering speed. Jeffreiter Werner Hoffmann of the 84th Infantry Division was captured on March 25 TH. His interrogation revealed the psychological impact of technological obsolescence. We held our positions for 2 days, firing at crossing sites, believing we were stopping them. Then Americans appeared behind us. When we asked prisoners how they crossed, they pointed at those swimming trucks. Aloinen threw down his weapon and said, "If they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is over." Nobody disagreed. We'd been told the Rhine would hold them for weeks, give time for miracle weapons or negotiations. Instead, they crossed it like it was a stream. What else had we been lied to about? Everything, probably. One of the most remarkable episodes of the Rhine crossing occurred on March 25th, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on personally crossing the Rhine, an act that combined genuine historical consciousness with theatrical showmanship. This wasn't mere theatrics, though it certainly played well for cameras. Churchill understood the historical significance of Allied armies crossing Germany's sacred river, and he was determined to witness it personally. Churchill, accompanied by Field Marshal Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, first observed the crossings from a demolished railway bridge at Wesel, watching through binoculars as the DUKWs streamed back and forth. Then, against the urgent advice of his security detail, and in direct violation of Eisenhower's explicit orders forbidding such risks, Churchill boarded an American LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and crossed to the eastern bank. Montgomery's Edecamp. Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull. Warren recorded the scene with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. The PM was absolutely determined. He said, "I'm going to cross the Rhine. I've waited years for this moment." The American crew was horrified when they realized who their passenger was, but Churchill was already aboard. Cigar clamped in his teeth, making V for victory signs. There was nothing we could do but pray. The Germans didn't score a lucky shell hit. For 30 minutes, the British Prime Minister stood on German soil east of the Rhine, while German artillery shells landed close enough to spray the party with debris. Churchill reportedly picked up a handful of earth and declared, "German soil." At last, the crossing was militarily unnecessary and took unnecessary risks with a priceless life, but it was psychologically powerful. The leader of Britain, which had stood alone against Hitler in 1940, standing on conquered German territory, was theater but theater that mattered deeply to British and Allied morale. The incident revealed another advantage of the amphibious assault that German planners had never considered. Churchill could cross because DUKWs and landing craft were continuously operating across multiple points. With traditional bridging operations, such a crossing would have required shutting down military traffic on a critical bridge, disrupting operations for hours. The distributed nature of the amphibious operation made Churchill's theatrical gesture possible without compromising military effectiveness. It was a perfect metaphor. Allied industrial capacity was so abundant that it could simultaneously wage war and stage political theater. The success of the Rhine crossing accelerated the end of the European war by an estimated 3 weeks, according to post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. This acceleration came not merely from the fact of crossing, but from the speed and breadth of the operation enabled by amphibious vehicles that transformed operational tempo. Traditional river crossing doctrine would have required sequential operations stretched across weeks. First, establish small bridgeheads through costly assault boat operations. Second, build bridges under fire while defenders concentrated artillery on fixed targets. Third, reinforce gradually as bridge capacity allowed. Fourth, conduct supply buildup before breakout operations. This methodical process, even when successful, would have taken 2 to 3 weeks minimum. German forces would have had time to establish new defensive lines, destroy infrastructure and supplies, and potentially create conditions for negotiated surrender rather than unconditional capitulation. Instead, the Allies achieved in 72 hours what German planning assumed would take weeks or prove impossible altogether. By March 26th, 3 Allied armies, the U.S. Ninth Army, the British Second Army, and the U.S. First Army, were racing into Germany's interior with virtually no pause for consolidation. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, was being rapidly encircled. By April 1st, the speed of advance prevented Germans from destroying factories, bridges, and supplies that might have prolonged resistance. Germany's remaining industrial capacity was being captured intact. General Omar Bradley calculated the lives saved with characteristic bluntness. If we'd had to cross the Rhine, the traditional assault boats, engineers building bridges under fire, gradual reinforcement while Germans concentrated against fixed crossing points, we'd have lost 50,000 men minimum. Probably more. The DUKWs turned what should have been a bloodbath worse than Anzio or Salerno into a transportation exercise. Technology didn't make war painless, but it made victory far less costly than it might have been. The strategic impact rippled eastward, influencing the final disposition of forces that would shape post-war Europe. Soviet forces learning of the Rhine crossings, success through their intelligence networks and official communications, accelerated their own operations toward Berlin. Stalin, paranoid that the Western Allies might capture the Nazi capital first, ordered his commanders to accelerate their advance, regardless of casualties. The race between East and West that would shape post-war Europe and define the Cold War was intensified by DUKWs, crossing the Rhine faster than anyone had thought possible. By March 28th, the German command structure in the West had effectively disintegrated, not merely defeated but rendered irrelevant by the speed of collapse. Communications between units broke down as headquarters retreated or were overrun. The speed of the Allied advance enabled by the Rhine Crossing success prevented any coordinated defensive response. Field Marshal Walter Muddle, commanding Army Group B, found his forces divided and trapped in the Ruhr pocket, 325,000 men encircled, because they couldn't retreat faster than Allied forces could advance. Muddle's final order, issued March 29th, revealed despair unprecedented in German military communications. The enemy has achieved the impossible at the Rhine through means we failed to anticipate. Further organized resistance only increases suffering without military purpose. I release all soldiers under my command from their oath to the fore. Save yourselves as best you can. Muddle himself committed suicide on April 21st in a forest near Duisburg rather than surrender. Unable to accept a defeat that felt less like military failure than technological obsolescence, the psychological collapse was complete and cascading. Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought tenaciously for every German village, who had conducted fighting withdrawals with professional competence for months, now surrendered in mass. The Rhine had held mythic significance in German consciousness, the sacred river that had protected Germanic tribes from Roman legions, that had marked civilization's boundary for 2,000 years. Its loss in 3 days meant the war was truly, irrevocably over. Units that might have conducted guerrilla warfare simply dissolved, soldiers streaming westward to surrender to Americans and British rather than face Soviet capture. Civilian morale, already shattered by years of bombing and the obvious approach of defeat, collapsed completely. The Rhine Crossing demonstrated that no natural barrier could protect Germany, that the technological and industrial gap was if the Rhine could be crossed in 3 days by vehicles that swam, what defense remained? Local officials began negotiating surrender of their towns to avoid destruction. Nazi Party officials who had threatened civilians with execution for defeatism quietly removed their uniforms and tried to blend into the civilian population. Hans Frank, Nazi Governor General of Poland and one of the regime's most brutal officials, wrote in his diary an entry that captured the existential despair of Germany's leadership. The Rhine is crossed. The sacred river that protected Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If there was any doubt about our fate, it is gone. We face not defeat, but annihilation. The Americans cross the Rhine the way one crosses a street. How do you fight that? How do you negotiate with that? We are not losing a war. We are being erased by industrial capacity we cannot match and cannot comprehend. The Rhine Crossing fundamentally changed military thinking about amphibious operations, influencing doctrine that would shape warfare for decades. Prior to March 1945, amphibious assault was primarily associated with seaborne invasions. Normandy, Pacific island hopping, the Great Opposed landings that dominated newsreels and public imagination. The Rhine demonstrated that amphibious capabilities were equally decisive in continental warfare, that rivers need not be obstacles requiring days of preparation, but could become highways given proper equipment and doctrine. The U.S. Army's official history, published in the 1950s after extensive analysis, concluded, the mass employment of DUKWs at the Rhine represents a revolution in military affairs equivalent in significance to the introduction of armor in World War I or air power in World War II. The ability to treat water obstacles as highways, rather than barriers, fundamentally alters operational planning, force structure, and defensive doctrine. No future military force can afford to ignore amphibious mobility as a core capability, rather than a specialized niche capability. Soviet observers attached to Allied headquarters took careful notes that would influence Red Army doctrine for decades. Colonel Ivan Yakushkin reported to Moscow in late March 1945. The Americans have solved the problem of river crossing through industrial mass production rather than tactical innovation. They simply built so many amphibious vehicles that rivers become irrelevant as defensive obstacles. This has profound implications for any future conflict in Europe, where rivers dominate geography. Recommend immediate development of comparable Soviet amphibious capabilities. The recommendation would lead to Soviet development of extensive amphibious vehicle families, though Soviet designs would reflect different priorities than American pragmatism. The British Army, despite having participated successfully in the operation, conducted extensive post-war studies that reveal characteristic British analytical thoroughness. Brigadier Richard Goodbody, who commanded an amphibious brigade during the crossing, wrote in a 1946 assessment, "We must never again assume that water barriers provide significant defensive advantage against an enemy with proper amphibious equipment and the industrial capacity to mass produce it." The Rhine Crossing proves conclusively that industrial capacity trumps geographic advantage. A modestly defended river crossed by abundant amphibious vehicles is less significant than a stream defended by troops without those vehicles. The lesson is clear. Either possess amphibious mobility yourself, or ensure your enemy lacks it. While generals claimed credit for the Rhine Crossing success in their memoirs and after-action reports, the true heroes were often the DUKW crews who made it possible, enlisted men and junior officers whose names rarely appeared in official histories. Men, many from US Navy detachments who found themselves in the middle of Germany operating what amounted to floating targets, performed with courage and skill that deserves recognition. Seaman First Class Joseph Bernardine of Naval Unit 350 described a typical crossing with vivid detail that captures the terror masked by routine. You're driving this big, slow target across 1,300 feet of open water. German 88s are shooting at you. You can see the splashes walking toward you, mortars dropping around you with that distinctive whistle, machine guns trying to find the range, bullets skipping across the water. You can't zigzag much, or the current takes you downstream into God knows what. You just grip the wheel, push the throttle forward, and pray. The guys in back are completely helpless. They just sit there waiting to see if we make it. 8 minutes that feel like 8 hours. Then you hit the far bank and drive up. And you're alive, and you do it again, and again, and again. The maintenance crews performed miracles, keeping DUKWs operational under impossible conditions, working under fire and darkness to repair battle damage and mechanical failures. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company Maintenance Section reported with professional pride, "We were patching holes with anything we could find. Ration cans hammered flat, chunks of German armor plates scavenged from knocked-out panzers, even wooden plugs wrapped in canvas and sealed with tar. We had ducks come back with 10, 15 holes in them, water pouring in, and we'd patch them up and send them back across within an hour. If it floated and moved, we kept it running. That was the only standard that mattered." British DUKW operators, trained by Americans, but adding their own innovations drawn from years of combined operations experience, proved equally resourceful. Sergeant Major William Davies of the Royal Army Service Corps developed a technique for using DUKWs to rescue crews from knocked-out tanks, an innovation that saved dozens of lives. We'd drive right up to burning tanks. The DUKW's height gave us protection from small arms and use our vehicle as a shield while we pulled wounded tankers aboard. The water constantly dripping from our hull helped with the heat. We saved dozens of lads that way, boys who'd have burned or been captured otherwise. The DUKW wasn't just a supply truck. It was an ambulance, a rescue vehicle, a weapons carrier, whatever you needed it to be. After the war, German military professionals conducted exhaustive studies of their defeat with characteristic trying to understand how the Wehrmacht had lost so completely. The Rhine Crossing featured prominently in these analyses as a failure of imagination as much as material, a failure rooted in cultural assumptions about warfare that proved catastrophically wrong. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff who had been imprisoned by Hitler after the July 1944 assassination attempt, wrote in 1948 from his comfortable American detention, "We prepared extensively for the Allied Rhine crossing. We positioned our reserves according to sound operational doctrine. We registered our artillery on likely crossing points. We prepared demolitions and obstacles. We did everything correctly according to our doctrine, which had been refined through centuries of military history and 5 years of modern war. We simply never imagined the enemy would have hundreds of vehicles that could ignore the river's existence. This wasn't a failure of intelligence gathering. We had observed these vehicles. It was a failure of imagination. We couldn't conceive that an enemy would produce such equipment in such quantities." The Wehrmacht's final operational study completed by imprisoned German officers in 1946 as part of the U.S. Army's historical documentation project, admitted with painful honesty. The American deployment of amphibious vehicles en masse represents a form of warfare we neither anticipated nor could counter with available resources. Even had we known their exact numbers and capabilities, German industry could not have produced comparable numbers of vehicles. The Rhine Crossing was lost in Detroit's factories long before it was fought on the Rhine's banks. We were defeated by an industrial system we could not match, even if we had fully understood it. Colonel General Heinz Good, father of German armored warfare and arguably Germany's most innovative military thinker, offered perhaps the most insightful observation in his 1950 memoir. We Germans perfected the art of warfare. The Americans perfected the business of warfare. At the Rhine, business defeated art. Their swimming trucks were not elegant, not sophisticated, not interesting from an engineering standpoint, but they were numerous, reliable, and effective. That is the American way of war. Adequate solutions mass-produced overwhelm perfect solutions produced in small numbers. We never learned this lesson, and it cost us everything. Despite its decisive impact on ending the European War, the Dukes' role in crossing the Rhine has been largely overshadowed in popular history by more dramatic events: the accidental capture of the Remagen Bridge, Montgomery's massive artillery bombardments, the spectacular airborne operation. Yet veterans from both sides understood the amphibious truck's true significance in ways that historians and general audiences often missed. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his 1948 memoir Crusade in Europe, wrote with characteristic plainness, "Analysts will debate endlessly what shortened the war most: strategic bombing, Soviet pressure from the east, Allied material superiority, or unity of command. I believe historians consistently underestimate the simple DUKW. Without it, the Rhine would have been a killing ground that might have prolonged the war by months. With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday. The psychological impact of crossing the Rhine so easily, so quickly, so casually, may have done more to break German will than all the bombs we dropped." The DUKWs continued serving after the Rhine, crossing the Elbe, the Danube, and dozens of smaller rivers as Allied forces penetrated deeper into Germany. They evacuated concentration camp survivors too weak to walk, transporting them from camps to hospitals with a gentleness that seems incongruous given their military origin. They transported food to starving German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicles that had broken Germany's last military barrier became instruments of humanitarian relief, demonstrating that military technology could serve humanitarian purposes once victory was achieved. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company recalled using his DUKW after Germany's surrender with an irony that captures the strangeness of war's end. Same vehicle that crossed the Rhine under fire carrying assault troops was now delivering food to German kids in flooded areas near Hamburg. They'd never seen anything like it, a truck that could swim. Kids would chase us down the street calling out, "Schwimmwagen," wanting rides. Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives after peace came. Maybe that's what victory looks like, turning weapons into tools. The 21,147 DUKWs produced during World War II represented more than just vehicles. They embodied an American industrial philosophy fundamentally different from the German approach. A philosophy that would ultimately prove decisive not just in World War II but in shaping the post-war world. While German engineers pursued perfection in small numbers, American manufacturers pursued adequacy in overwhelming quantity. This wasn't merely a difference in production methods, but reflected deeper cultural values about problem solving, acceptable standards, and the relationship between quality and quantity. This philosophy extended far beyond The same factories producing amphibious trucks were turning out standard 2.5-ton trucks at rates of 10,000 per month. The steel for DUKW hulls came from mills producing Liberty ships every 42 hours. The engines were built on assembly lines that could shift from truck engines to aircraft, engines to tank engines, with minimal retooling. The entire system was integrated in ways that German planners, accustomed to specialized production, could barely comprehend. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, visited a DUKW assembly line in 1944 and observed with satisfaction. In 1 hour, I watched them complete 6 DUK, each one imperfect, by German standards rough welds. Simple solutions, components that weren't hand-fitted. Everything painted the same olive drab, but each one would cross the Rhine reliably. German factories would spend a month building one perfect amphibious vehicle with hand-fitted components and exquisite engineering. We built 180 good enough ones in that time. The difference between perfection and adequacy, multiplied by American industrial scale, equals victory. De German lando a ser slipper. By comparison, revealed the limitations of the craft production approach that had characterized German industry since medieval guilds. Each LWS required specialized workers with specific skills, custom components manufactured to tight tolerances, and extensive testing of each individual vehicle. When Allied bombing disrupted supply chains, production ceased entirely because alternatives couldn't be substituted. A missing specialized component meant no vehicle could be completed. American DUKW production simply substituted alternate parts from the vast catalog of standardized components and continued without pause. This flexibility, this interchangeability, this pragmatic acceptance of good enough over perfect, these were American strengths the German industrial culture could never match. The Rhine Crossing success reverberated through the final weeks of the war. Its psychological impact on German forces throughout the Reich, impossible to overstate. German units in Italy that had held mountain positions for months suddenly began withdrawing northward. Field Marshal Kesselring reported from the Italian theater, "News of the Rhine Crossing caused immediate deterioration in troop morale beyond anything I have witnessed. Soldiers asked their officers, if the Rhine cannot stop them, what can? I have no answer that does not sound like lies. The men know the war is lost. They fight now from duty and fear of Soviet capture, not from hope of victory." German forces in Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands bypassed, but still potentially dangerous, began negotiating local surrenders with Allied commanders. The myth of the impregnable Rhine had sustained hope for a negotiated peace, for holding out until war weariness forced the Allies to accept something less than unconditional surrender. Its fall in 72 hours made continued resistance seem not just difficult but pointless. Why die for a regime that couldn't defend Germany's most sacred natural barrier? Eben in Berlin, besieged by Soviet forces in the war's final days. The Rhine Crossing had impact that transcended its geographical distance. Hitler's final recorded military conference on April 27th, just days before his suicide, included his bitter lament. The Rhine was lost because we didn't anticipate their amphibious capabilities. We prepared for the wrong war. We expected them to fight as we would fight, with careful planning and sequential operations. Instead, they improvised with industrial capacity. They turned trucks into boats and boats into trucks and made our most formidable barrier irrelevant. It was perhaps his only accurate military assessment of the entire conflict, a recognition that came far too late to matter. At a 1985 reunion of Rhine Crossing veterans in Lexington, Kentucky, aging soldiers from both sides gathered to remember those 3 days 40 years earlier that had ended Nazi Germany's last hope. The event, organized by veterans groups, brought together American, British, Canadian, and even German veterans in a spirit of reconciliation that would have seemed impossible in 1945. The DUKW, preserved as monuments by military museums, drew particular attention from veterans who remembered them with a mixture of affection and horror. Former Sergeant James Mitchell, who had commanded a DUKW in the 819th Amphibious Truck Company, stood beside one of the preserved vehicles and reflected, "Ugly thing, isn't it? Like a boat that mated with a truck and produced something that was neither fish nor fowl. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis thought it impossible. We didn't outfight them, they were good soldiers. We outproduced them, outnavigated them, out-imagined them. We won because our factories could make thousands of these things while theirs couldn't make hundreds." Former Obergefreiter Hans, who had defended the Rhine with the 181st Infantry Division and spent 2 years in Allied prisoner of war camps before rebuilding his life in post-war Germany, attended as an invited guest. His speech to the veterans was powerful and received with respect. "You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. The moment I saw those vehicles driving out of the Rhine that morning, water pouring off them, troops jumping out fresh and ready to fight, I knew the war was over. not lost over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway. I surrendered 3 days later. I am alive today because I surrendered to men with swimming trucks rather than dying for a cause already lost. The reunion highlighted a profound truth that military historians sometimes miss in focusing on strategy and tactics. The Rhine Crossing succeeded not through superior courage. Both sides displayed courage, and not through superior tactical brilliance. The plan was workmanlike rather than innovative. It succeeded through industrial capacity, channeled through innovation, through the American ability to identify problems and solve them with mass-produced tools rather than perfect weapons. The heroes were as much the assembly line workers in Pontiac, Michigan, as the soldiers in Germany. Victory came from factories as much as battlefields. March 23rd to 26th, 1945 marked more than a successful military operation. It represented the triumph of American industrial democracy over German military aristocracy, of mass production over craft perfection, of pragmatic innovation over rigid doctrine, of a citizen soldier army equipped with adequate tools over a professional warrior caste armed with perfect weapons they lacked in sufficient numbers. The DUKW itself was quintessentially American, not the best possible amphibious vehicle by engineering standards, but the best that could be mass-produced with existing technology, operated by minimally trained soldiers, and maintained under field conditions. It solved problems through quantity rather than quality, through standardization rather than specialization, through interchangeable parts rather than hand-fitting. It was operated by citizen soldiers with minimal training rather than professional warriors with years of experience. This approach horrified German military professionals who had been trained to value expertise, specialization, and perfection. General von Rundstedt, in British captivity after the war, complained with barely concealed contempt. War has become a factory manager's business rather than a general's art. Your swimming trucks were not weapons of war in any traditional sense, but products of industry, indistinguishable from automobiles or refrigerators. You defeated us not on the battlefield, but in the factory. There is no honor in that, no artistry, no martial virtue. But there is victory. Yet this transformation was precisely the point, the fundamental lesson of industrial total war that Germany never fully grasped. America had democratized warfare, just as it had democratized production and consumption. The DUKW represented not just military capability, but industrial ideology, the belief that any problem could be solved through sufficient production properly organized, that adequacy multiplied by abundance equals superiority, that good enough solutions available immediately beat perfect solutions available eventually. These principles would shape not just military affairs, but American society and economy for generations. The final accounting of the Rhine Crossing operation reveals the DUKW's decisive impact through statistics that tell a story of systematic German underestimation. Vehicles involved: hundreds of DUKWs in direct Rhine Crossing operations, 600 British Buffalo LVTs. In support, over 2,000 DUKWs available in theater, while approximately 100 German LWS were produced, total with few operational. Transportation achievement: March 23rd to 31st, 1945. 15,000 troops transported across, 1,200 vehicles moved, 3,000 tons of supplies delivered, 2,000 wounded evacuated, over 5,000 individual DUKW crossings completed. Production comparison: 21,147 DUKWs manufactured by the United States, 562,750 standard trucks. Sharing DUKW components providing parts commonality: approximately 100 LWS produced by Germany, with 0 German vehicles specifically designed for river assault in meaningful numbers. Time factors: 38 days from DUKW concept to prototype, 72 hours to breach Rhine defenses, 3 weeks of war shortened by rapid crossing, 50,000 estimated Allied casualties prevented by avoiding traditional river assault methods. Cost analysis: $10,750 per DUKW. Approximately 75,000 Reichsmarks per LWS, a 7-to-1 cost ratio favoring American production with infinite advantage in actual deployment since German vehicles were unavailable in militarily significant numbers. The DUKW's role in crossing the Rhine transcended its immediate military impact to demonstrate a principle of modern warfare that would remain relevant through the Cold War and beyond. Technological surprise can be achieved not through secret weapons, but through mass deployment of capabilities enemies dismissed as insignificant. Post-war military doctrine incorporated Rhine lessons. Deep NATO war plans during the Cold War emphasized amphibious vehicles for crossing Eastern Europe's many rivers, assuming that any conflict with the Soviet Union would require rapid advances across river obstacles. The Soviet Union developed entire families of amphibious vehicles, learning from American success, while adapting designs to Soviet operational requirements and production capabilities. Modern military forces worldwide consider river crossing capability essential rather than specialized, a direct legacy of the Rhine operation. Beyond military implications, the Rhine Crossing validated American production philosophy in ways that influenced post-war civilian industry. Quality mattered less than quantity. If the quantity was sufficient, a principle that would shape American consumer goods industries. Perfection mattered less than availability. Better to have an adequate product now than a perfect product later. Sophistication mattered less than reliability. Simple solutions that worked beat complex solutions that didn't. These lessons shaped post-war American industry far beyond military applications. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe through massive American aid, reflected DUKW philosophy. Massive standardized aid rather than customized solutions, tailored to each nation's specific situation. The Interstate Highway System, built in the 1950s, applied military logistics lessons to civilian infrastructure. The space race, though often portrayed as triumph of scientific genius, actually emphasized reliable mass-produced components over handcrafted perfection. American success in all these domains reflected the same principles that had put DUKWs across the Rhine. Adequate solutions, mass-produced immediately available, beat perfect solutions produced in insufficient numbers. Perhaps the DUKW's greatest contribution was psychological rather than material. A demonstration of American capability that convinced enemies and allies alike of American industrial supremacy. German soldiers and civilians who witnessed American forces treating the sacred Rhine like a minor inconvenience understood viscerally that they faced not another army but an industrial system of overwhelming capacity. This casual demonstration of industrial might did more to convince Germans of defeat's inevitability than any propaganda could achieve, more than strategic bombing, more than battlefield victories. Post-war interviews with German civilians revealed consistent themes that illuminate this psychological dimension. They had expected Americans to be stopped at the Rhine for weeks or months, giving time for miracle weapons or negotiations for a conditional surrender. Instead, Americans crossed in 3 days using vehicles Germans didn't know existed in such numbers, treating Germany's most formidable natural barrier as if it were a stream. The shock was profound and lasting, fundamentally altering German perceptions of American power. Frau Elisabeth Becker, who lived near Wessel and witnessed the crossing, recalled decades later, "We heard the artillery on March 20th. The Rhine had always protected us. On March 26th, American trucks were driving past our home heading east, still wet from crossing, water dripping from their wheels. My father, a veteran of the Great War who had fought at Verdun, saw them and said quietly, 'When your enemy can drive trucks through rivers, the war is over. There is nothing left to fight with.' He was right. We surrendered to the first American patrol that came to our door." This psychological collapse accelerated German acceptance of defeat and occupation, preventing the guerrilla resistance that Allied planners had feared. Resistance movements that might have emerged never materialized in significant numbers. The demonstration of American industrial capacity at the Rhine convinced Germans that resistance was futile, not from military defeat alone but from technological obsolescence, from confronting a form of warfare they could not match, even if they had unlimited courage and determination. Winston Churchill, who had personally crossed the Rhine during the operation, in a moment of theatrical political symbolism, offered perhaps the most eloquent assessment in his multi-volume war memoirs published in the early 1950s. The Rhine Crossing of March 1945 marked not merely the breach of Germany's last geographical barrier, but the triumph of a new form of warfare over an old one. The Americans, with their amphibious trucks, had solved through industry what we Europeans had attempted through strategy for centuries. They didn't defeat the Rhine through military genius. They ignored it through industrial abundance. I watched those ungainly vehicles, part boat, part truck, wholly effective, streaming across waters that had protected Germany since Roman legions first reached the river. Each DUKW was a messenger, carrying proof of American industrial supremacy that no propaganda could match. Churchill continued in a passage that reveals his historian's sense of the moment's significance. In my long life, I have witnessed many military innovations that changed warfare. The machine gun, the tank, the aircraft carrier, but few impressed me as profoundly as those simple swimming trucks at the Rhine. They represented not technological brilliance, the engineering was straightforward, but organizational genius. Not German-style perfectionism, but American-style pragmatism. When I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 25, 1945, watching DUKWs emerge from the river like primordial beasts evolving from sea to land, I knew I was witnessing not just the end of this war, but the beginning of the American century. The nation that could turn trucks into boats and cross rivers like roads would dominate the post-war world. On May 7, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Rhine Crossing, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France. Among the factors he cited in explaining Germany's defeat was the enemy's unexpected amphibious capabilities at the Rhine, which eliminated our last natural defensive barrier. This admission, buried in longer explanations about strategic bombing and Soviet pressure, revealed the crossing's true impact on German military thinking. The Rhine was supposed to provide time for miracle weapons or favorable negotiations. Instead, it fell in 3 days, and with it fell Germany's last hope. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander, submitted in June 1945, allocated significant credit to the humble DUKW. No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from limitation into advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months. The DUKW's role in victory deserves recognition equal to any weapon system developed during the war. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Rhine occurred on May 10, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender, carrying not soldiers but food supplies for German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicle that had broken Germany's last military barrier had become an instrument of humanitarian relief, demonstrating that military technology could serve peaceful purposes once victory was achieved. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, driving that last DUKW across the Rhine, recalled, "No shooting this time, no artillery, just a pleasant drive across the river like a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the eastern bank, hoping we had chocolate or candy. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food to keep them from starving. That's what those ducks did, I guess. They turned the impossible into routine, turned enemies into people needing help. Strange way to end a war, but better than most endings." The Rhine Crossing of March 1945 stands as a watershed moment in military history, significant not merely for tactical brilliance or strategic importance, but for what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare in the industrial age. The DUKW, unarmored, unremarkable in most respects, had rendered irrelevant a geographical barrier that had protected Germany for 2,000 years. German defenders who prepared for every contingency their doctrine could imagine never conceived that American industry could produce over 21,000 vehicles that made rivers militarily irrelevant as defensive obstacles. They prepared for the wrong war, not through incompetence or lack of effort, but through inability to imagine American productive capacity and willingness to solve military problems through industrial abundance. The Rhine wasn't conquered through superior tactics or overwhelming courage. It was industrially obsoleted, rendered irrelevant by American pragmatism that valued adequate solutions, mass-produced over perfect solutions, produced in insufficient numbers. The hundreds of DUKWs that crossed the Rhine between March 23rd and 31st, 1,945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried proof that American mass production could transform warfare's fundamental assumptions, that industrial capacity, properly applied, could achieve what military genius alone could not, that wars in the industrial age would be won not by the best soldiers but by the best factories. Every German soldier who watched a DUKW drive up the Rhine's eastern bank witnessed the death of traditional military limitations and the birth of industrial warfare as the dominant form of organized violence. Field Marshal Montgomery summarized the operation with uncharacteristic brevity that nonetheless captured its essence. "We didn't assault the Rhine. We commuted across it." This transformation of the extraordinary into the mundane, the impossible into the routine, was the DUKW's true victory. The Rhine Crossing demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity properly applied could achieve what military genius alone could not. The Wehrmacht, perhaps history's most professionally competent military force, was defeated not by superior strategy or tactics, but by swimming trucks produced on Detroit assembly lines by workers who had been making automobiles 3 years earlier. In the end, the German defenders were correct in one crucial assessment. The Rhine could not be crossed against determined resistance using traditional methods. They simply never imagined that American industry would make traditional methods obsolete. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 didn't just transport soldiers. They carried the future of warfare, demonstrating that industrial might would trump geographical advantage, that mass production would defeat craft perfection, that pragmatic innovation would overwhelm rigid doctrine. The Rhine crossings' true lesson was not military, but industrial. A lesson that would shape not just warfare, but international relations and economic competition throughout the Cold War and beyond. In the 20th century's total wars, victory belonged not to nations with the best soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but to nations with the best factories and the industrial capacity to turn production into military power. The German defenders never knew Americans had amphibious trucks in such abundance. Not because of intelligence failure they had observed the vehicles, but because they couldn't conceive such plenty in a world where Germany itself suffered chronic shortages of everything, from fuel to ammunition to basic food. That conceptual blindness, more than any tactical error or strategic miscalculation, doomed the Third Reich's last stand at Germany's sacred river. The Rhine fell not to courage or tactical brilliance, but to American industry's ability to turn an idea into a prototype in 38 days, then manufacture 21,000 copies in 3 years, then deploy them in sufficient numbers to make Europe's greatest river militarily irrelevant. That achievement, mundane, unglamorous, relentlessly, practica may be the truest measure of American power in World War II, and a legacy that shaped the post-war world for generations.